It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon when I discovered that my life, the one I had spent decades building, had quietly come apart. The rain pressed against the windows like a whispering accusation as I stepped inside our home, weary from another long day at work. I was 62, still strong in body but worn in spirit, craving only the familiar comfort of the evening, a cup of tea, my husband's voice drifting from the living room, the faint trace of his cologne in the air. But that evening, the silence felt heavier than usual. "Jim?" I called, hanging my coat by the door. No answer. Only the low hum of the refrigerator responded. A strange unease stirred in me as I crossed the hallway. The house looked the same. The framed wedding photo, the vase of wilting flowers. But the air felt different, as if something sacred had been broken. Then I saw it. A letter on the coffee table, his handwriting unmistakable. My name written across the front, neat and deliberate. For a moment I simply stared at it, as if by refusing to touch it I could keep the truth sealed inside. But my hands moved on their own. I unfolded the paper and began to read. The words were short, cruelly simple. He was leaving. Leaving me. For his ex-wife, Carol. He wrote that he'd made a mistake trying to rebuild a life with me. That he had always felt something unresolved between them. That he needed to follow his heart, whatever that meant, after all these years. I read the letter twice before the meaning fully sank in. Then a third time, just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. It wasn't long or poetic, but every line cut through me like glass. Jim was gone. After 30 years of marriage, he had chosen to walk out not with a conversation, not even with an apology, but with a letter on a coffee table. I sat down, the paper trembling in my hands. My mind flooded with old memories. Our first apartment, the years of working overtime so he could start his business, the quiet mornings when I believed love meant endurance. I had sacrificed so much, and now the man I'd built my life around had decided it was no longer enough. At first, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe he was angry. Maybe it was temporary. But deep down, I knew better. Jim wasn't impulsive. He had planned this. I stared at the rain sliding down the window, my reflection faint in the glass. For decades, I had been the steady one, the caretaker, the peacemaker, the one who smoothed every rough edge in our lives. I had built a world around the promise that love, if tended carefully, would last. Now I saw how naive that was. When I finally stood, the house no longer felt like home. It was a shell, echoing with absences. The empty space on the coat rack where his jacket should have been, the bare dresser, the missing toothbrush. He hadn't just left a letter. He had erased himself from the life we shared, but the cruelest twist of all came later that night, when I remembered something that made my stomach drop. Carol. I knew her name not only because she was Jim's ex-wife, but because she worked for me. A year earlier, she had applied for a position at the consulting firm where I was a senior manager. Her resume had been impressive. Her demeanor polished and professional. I hadn't thought twice before hiring her. How could I have known? She had walked into my office smiling, thanking me for the opportunity, while quietly weaving herself back into Jim's life behind my back. The realization burned through me. She had been right there all along. In my meetings, in my office, sharing polite small talk and waiting for her moment. And Jim, in his weakness, had fallen right back into her orbit. It was a betrayal within a betrayal. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come. Instead, I sat in the quiet house, listening to the storm gather strength outside. The walls felt closer, the air thicker. The anger came later, sharp, electric, cleansing. How dare they? How dare she infiltrate my world like that? How dare he use the life I built as a stage for their reunion? But beneath the fury was something else, a realization forming quietly, almost gently. They might have destroyed my marriage, but they hadn't destroyed me. Not yet. Somewhere deep inside, a spark of resolve took shape. I didn't know what I would do or how I would confront them, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to let them dictate the ending of my story. As the night deepened, I folded the letter and placed it back on the table. The paper was damp from my tears, the ink slightly smudged, but I didn't care. Let it stay there, a monument to everything that had broken. and everything that was about to be rebuilt. By morning, the rain had stopped, but the silence remained. I stood by the window watching the first light of dawn spill across the street. Somewhere out there, Jim was starting his new life. Somewhere out there, Carol was smiling, thinking she'd won. But I wasn't finished. Not by a long shot. The morning after the letter, I sat at my kitchen table with a cup of untouched coffee, staring at the empty chair across from me. The weight of what had happened pressed down like a fog. Every sound in the house felt louder. The creak of the floorboards, the ticking clock, the whisper of rain on the window. By the time I reached the office, I had painted on my calmest expression. Years in management had trained me to perform composure even when my heart was falling apart. The familiar hum of the building greeted me. Phones ringing, shoes clicking down polished floors. Polite greetings from co-workers who had no idea that my world had just collapsed. I thought I could lose myself in work, bury the pain beneath routine. But fate had a cruel sense of timing. When I stepped into my office, I found a folder on my desk. It was from Carol. Her handwriting, looped, confident, was unmistakable. For a moment, I couldn't move. I had managed to avoid her since the storm began, convincing myself that distance would dull the sting. But now, her presence lingered in every line of that note, in the faint trace of perfume on the folder. I remembered the day I hired her. She'd walked into the interview with perfect posture and a practiced smile, the kind that made people think she had nothing to hide. She spoke with polished charm, answering every question with just the right balance of humility and ambition. I'd admired her professionalism, how foolish I'd been. As I sat at my desk now, I replayed every conversation we'd shared over the past year, her subtle compliments about my marriage, her casual questions about Jim, her offers to help with company events. Each memory twisted like a knife. She hadn't just been working for me. She'd been studying me, and somewhere along the way, she'd found her opening. By lunchtime, the whispers had started. Colleagues glanced my way, their smiles strained, their conversations hushed. I knew how gossip worked in an office like ours, sharp, efficient, merciless. They knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Carol, of course, was the picture of professionalism. She walked past my door later that afternoon with a polite nod, holding a stack of reports as if nothing had happened. But her eyes lingered on me for a fraction too long, steady, assessing, almost taunting. In that glance, I saw it clearly. She knew that I knew. The next few days passed in a blur of mechanical movement. I attended meetings, signed contracts, reviewed proposals, all while pretending my world hadn't been dismantled. But beneath that facade, a quiet storm was building. The old Margaret, the woman who smoothed over everyone else's mistakes, who kept peace at all costs, was still there. But she was beginning to crack. Every time I saw Carol's face across a meeting table, the crack deepened. She would smile that composed, graceful smile and speak in her calm, measured tone, while I sat across from her, fighting the urge to tear through the mask she wore. She was clever, I'll give her that. She played her role perfectly. No overt provocations, no unprofessional remarks. Just subtle jabs, a pointed compliment here, a carefully phrased question there, that reminded me she held something I had lost. I began to wonder if Jim knew I was her boss. Surely he must, or had she kept that to herself, turning our connection into her own little secret? The thought made me sick. One evening, after everyone else had gone home, I sat alone in my office, staring at the reflection of the city lights in the window. My hands trembled as I replayed everything in my head. How had I let this happen? How had I been so blind? But amid the pain, another thought began to take shape, quiet, steady, undeniable. I wasn't powerless. I was her superior. Her livelihood depended on me. I didn't need to scream or threaten. I didn't need to stoop to her level. I just needed to remember who I was. I had spent my entire life holding others up. Jim, our home, our reputation, this company. And somewhere along the way, I had forgotten that I was the foundation beneath it all. That realization settled over me like armor. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The office was quiet, the air still. I placed Carol's folder neatly on her desk before she arrived, a small reminder that I was aware, that I saw everything. When she walked in, I greeted her calmly. "Morning, Carol," her step faltered. She hadn't expected warmth. "Morning, Margaret," she replied, a touch too quickly. I smiled, just faintly. "We'll need to talk later about your role on the new project." There was a flicker in her eyes, uncertainty, maybe even fear, but it vanished behind her polished expression. "Of course," she said. "Whenever's convenient." She turned and walked away, but I saw the stiffness in her shoulders. For the first time since that dreadful letter, I felt a spark of control returning. It wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming the ground beneath me. The sense that I still had a say in how this story unfolded. That afternoon, I watched her from across the open floor as she moved from desk to desk, charming everyone with her practiced ease. They saw the poised professional. I saw the woman who had dismantled my marriage from the inside out, but she didn't know one thing. The game had changed. That night, as I walked out of the building, I caught my reflection in the glass doors, tired, older, but not broken. Not anymore. The woman staring back at me wasn't the same one who had cried over a letter on her coffee table. She was steadier now, sharper, waiting. I knew that sooner or later Carol would test me again. She couldn't help herself, but when she did, I'd be ready. And when that moment came, it wouldn't be rage she'd see in my eyes. It would be power. By the following week, the storm inside me had changed shape. The grief that had left me hollow was slowly transforming into something far sharper. Focus. I had spent too long reacting to other people's choices. Jim had made his. Carol had made hers. Now it was my turn. When I walked into the office that Monday morning, something in my step had shifted. My heels clicked across the floor with purpose. The same co-workers who'd once glanced at me with pity now turned their heads as I passed. Maybe they sensed it, the quiet authority that comes from deciding you've had enough. Carol arrived a few minutes later. Her hair was perfect, her clothes immaculate as always. She offered her usual polite smile, but this time I didn't return it. Instead, I called her into my office. "Close the door," I said. Her composure flickered, but she obeyed. She took a seat, crossing her legs carefully, pretending she wasn't uneasy. I let the silence stretch. The air between us thickened, the faint hum of the air conditioner the only sound. Finally, I spoke. "I've been reviewing the upcoming project. Before we proceed, I think it's time we discussed your position here." Her brows lifted slightly, her tone smooth. "My position?" "Yes," I said, meeting her gaze. "You've been with the company nearly a year now, and I think it's important we establish clear boundaries. Professional boundaries." A shadow passed across her expression. She knew exactly what I meant. "Of course," she replied evenly. "If I've overstepped in any way, you have," I cut in gently but firmly. "But we'll move past that. Just understand, whatever personal situation exists outside this office, it has no place here. You report to me, Carol, and I expect that to be respected." For the first time, her polished mask cracked. "Margaret, I assure you," I leaned forward slightly, my voice calm but edged with steel. "I don't need your assurances. I need your professionalism," she swallowed, eyes narrowing almost imperceptibly. "Understood. Good." I let her sit in silence for a moment longer before dismissing her. She stood, chin tilted just enough to disguise the sting, and walked out without another word. When the door closed behind her, I exhaled slowly. My hands were steady. My heart was not. But that conversation wasn't about emotion. It was about reclaiming power, one measured word at a time. That afternoon, the office felt different. The tension that had shadowed every interaction between us had shifted ever so slightly in my favor. Carol avoided my gaze during meetings. When she spoke, her confidence carried a new brittleness. Like glass under pressure, I had taken back the narrative, but power, once tasted, demands more than quiet assertion. It demands consistency. So I began to set things right. Piece by piece, I restructured her responsibilities, moving her off certain projects she had used to showcase herself. I began to reassert my presence in meetings, my decisions firmer, my tone precise. People noticed. They stopped looking at me like a wounded wife and started seeing me again as what I had always been. The woman who kept this company running. And Carol, despite her efforts to stay composed, couldn't hide her frustration. I caught it in the tightness of her jaw, in the clipped tone of her replies, in the way her smiles had lost their warmth. Good. Let her feel it, the discomfort of losing control. Late one evening, as I was gathering my things, my office phone rang. The number flashed on the screen, one I hadn't seen in weeks. Jim. For a long moment, I simply stared at it. The sound of his name still had weight, but not the same kind as before. Finally, I answered. "Margaret," he began, his voice low, hesitant. I wanted to talk. I gathered that," I said evenly. "I didn't mean for things to happen like this," he continued. "I thought you'd understand." "Carol and I, well, we just don't," I interrupted softly. "Don't try to explain what you don't understand yourself." He hesitated. "I just want you to know I never wanted to hurt you." I almost laughed. The absurdity of it was almost poetic. "You left me a letter, Jim. That was your way of not hurting me?" He went quiet. I continued, my voice calm, even detached. "I spent years building a life with you, supporting you. And when things got hard, you ran back to the woman who made you miserable once before. You didn't just hurt me, Jim. You humiliated me. But you know what? You also freed me?" "Freed you?" His confusion was genuine, almost childlike. "Yes," I said, "because now I see how small you really are." There was silence on the line, long, heavy, final. When I hung up, I felt no tears, no ache. Only clarity. The next morning, I arrived early again. The air was cool and clean, the city outside still half asleep. I stood at my office window, coffee in hand, watching the first streaks of sunlight stretch across the skyline. I had survived the betrayal, endured the humiliation, and now I stood in the quiet aftermath, stronger than I had been in years. For decades, I had built my life around other people's needs, Jim's ambitions, the company's expectations, everyone's comfort but my own. That ended now. Carol still worked under me, but the balance had shifted entirely. She couldn't unnerve me anymore. I saw through her illusions, the charm, the composure, the subtle provocations. None of it mattered, because power wasn't loud. It didn't shout or threaten. Power was calm. Power was knowing that you could destroy someone, but choosing not to. That week, I called a full staff meeting. I stood at the head of the table, poised and direct. "We've had some distractions lately," I began, letting the words hang just long enough for everyone to glance toward Carol before returning to me. "That ends today. We're moving forward, focused, professional, unified." The message was clear. As the meeting ended, I caught Carol's gaze. Her expression was unreadable, but I could see the flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Respect. Or perhaps fear. Either would do. When the office emptied that evening, I lingered behind for a moment, running my fingers along the edge of the conference table. The woman I had been, the one who trembled at a letter and cried herself to sleep, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone capable, unafraid, and this was only the beginning. It had been nearly a month since I'd heard Jim's voice over the phone. I thought that chapter was finally closed, but people like Jim rarely know how to leave quietly. It began with a message, simple, almost pitiful. "I'm sorry, Margaret. Please, can we talk?" I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the delete button. For a moment, I felt the old ache stirring, the reflex to fix things, to make sense of them. But then I remembered the letter, the silence, the way he'd walked away without even granting me the decency of a goodbye. I deleted the message, but he didn't stop. Each day brought another text, another call, each one more desperate than the last. Then one morning, I stepped into the lobby of my office building, and there he was, Jim. He looked smaller somehow. His once confident posture had folded inward, his eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. For a fleeting second, I almost pitied him. Then I remembered Carol's smirk, the empty house, and the sound of my own heart breaking. "Margaret," he said softly, taking a hesitant step forward. I didn't move. "You shouldn't be here." "I just needed to see you," he murmured. "Please, just for a moment." I glanced around. The receptionist was watching, unsure whether to intervene. I forced a calm smile and gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby. "5 minutes," I said. He followed, his hands trembling slightly. When he spoke, his voice carried the familiar blend of guilt and self-pity I knew too well. "Carol and I." "It's not working." "It never really did," he confessed, his words spilling out like he'd rehearsed them. "She's changed, Margaret. She's cold, unpredictable. I made a mistake." I stared at him for a long time, letting the silence stretch until he began to squirm. "You didn't make a mistake, Jim," I said quietly. "You made a choice. There's a difference." He frowned, as if hoping for a softer response. "I thought you'd understand. You've always understood me." That line, so familiar, so manipulative, snapped something inside me. "Understand?" I repeated, my voice low. "You left me for your ex-wife. You humiliated me. And now you want understanding?" He looked at me helplessly. "I don't know how to fix this." "You can't," I said. "You can't fix what you chose to destroy." He tried again, his tone pleading now. "I miss you, Margaret. I can't stop thinking about you." I made the wrong decision. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. "You think saying that erases everything? You think walking back into my life after wrecking it makes you brave?" He fell silent, his shoulders slumping. I don't know where to go from here." "Forward," I said. "But not with me." He blinked, confused. "So that's it?" "Yes." When he finally turned and walked away, I felt no satisfaction, only relief. The kind that comes from realizing the person you once loved is no longer capable of hurting you. That afternoon, Carol avoided me completely. Perhaps she'd seen him. Perhaps she knew. Her silence, for once, was its own admission. But I also knew Jim wouldn't let go so easily. He never did. 2 days later, I received another call, this time from my assistant. "Margaret," she said nervously, "there's someone waiting in the parking lot for you. Says his name is Jim." I closed my eyes, exhaled slowly. "Tell security to escort him out." "Yes, ma'am." By the time I left the office, the space was clear, but the air still felt heavy, like the ghost of an old life lingering just beyond reach. That evening, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat by the window. The city glowed below, full of strangers moving forward with their lives. For years, I had built my identity around keeping things steady. For Jim, for my marriage, for everyone but myself. But I was finally beginning to understand that peace didn't come from control. It came from letting go. And I had let go. The next morning, the calm held. The calls stopped. The silence returned. But this time, it didn't feel like emptiness. It felt like freedom. For the first time in months, I began to sleep through the night. But just as I began to breathe again, the past found one last way to reach me. A letter. Delivered to my office. No name on the envelope, just to Margaret. My hands trembled as I opened it. For a moment, I feared it would be another goodbye. But it wasn't. It was a threat. Jim had filed for financial compensation. He wanted part of the house, part of my assets. After leaving me for another woman, he now wanted to be rewarded for it. The audacity was almost laughable. Almost. I sat there in stunned silence, reading the words over and over, each sentence more insulting than the last. It wasn't about money. It was about control. He couldn't stand that I was fine without him. That I had survived, thrived. I called my lawyer that same afternoon. "We'll fight this," she said firmly. "He doesn't have a case." "I know," I replied. "But I want to make sure he learns what happens when he underestimates me." That night, I stood before the mirror, studying my reflection under the soft light. My face was older, my eyes tired, but there was something new there too. A steadiness, a quiet strength. Jim had once said I was too strong, too composed, too hard to love. He wasn't wrong, but he'd forgotten something. Strength isn't the absence of love. It's what remains when love is gone. As I turned away from the mirror, a strange calm settled over me. I knew the battle ahead would be messy, lawyers, paperwork, and more of Jim's desperate pleas. But this time, I wasn't afraid, because for the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting to keep something. I was fighting to protect what was finally mine. And no man, not even the one I had once loved, was going to take that from me again. The letter from Jim marked the start of a new kind of war. Quiet, bureaucratic, and cold. There were no raised voices, no slammed doors, just papers and signatures and the dull hum of legal formality. But behind every document, I could feel the same venom that had laced his goodbye. He wasn't coming for money. He was coming for dignity, for control. My lawyer, a sharp woman named Evelyn, met me in her office surrounded by neat stacks of files and the faint smell of coffee. She listened in silence as I explained everything: the affair, the letter, the years of sacrifice. When I finished, she adjusted her glasses and said simply, "He won't win." Those 3 words steadied me more than she could have known. Still, the process was exhausting. Weeks blurred together in a haze of statements and affidavits. Every time I saw his name on a legal notice, I felt a flicker of anger, then, unexpectedly, a sense of pity. Jim had once been a man of dreams and ambition. Now, all he had left were demands. Carol's presence at work became almost ghost-like during that time. She avoided me whenever possible, keeping her voice low and her expressions unreadable. I didn't know if their relationship was still intact, and I didn't care. The satisfaction I once imagined feeling, seeing her squirm, watching him unravel, never came. I wasn't interested in vengeance anymore. I was interested in freedom. But freedom, I learned, always demands a fight. When the first court date arrived, I dressed carefully. Dark navy suit, hair pinned neatly, expression calm. I had rehearsed this moment in my head 100 times, but nothing could prepare me for the sight of Jim sitting across the room, looking like a stranger wearing his own skin. He avoided my gaze, though I could feel his eyes flick toward me when he thought I wasn't looking. Carol wasn't there. Maybe she had finally grown tired of his wreckage, or maybe she was simply too ashamed. Evelyn leaned close and whispered, "Remember, he's desperate." Desperation makes people sloppy. She was right. Jim's claims were weak, built on years of shared life, but no real contribution. Every argument he presented collapsed under the weight of his own negligence. I had worked, sacrificed, managed, built. He had followed, depended, drifted. When the judge asked if I had anything to say, I stood. My hands didn't shake. My voice didn't falter. "I supported my husband through 30 years of his failures and recoveries," I said. "I stood by him when he had nothing, when his business fell apart, when he lost his way. But he chose to leave, not because he was mistreated or deprived, but because he thought the grass was greener where he had already failed once before. Now he's asking to profit from my stability. I won't allow that. I've already paid enough." When I sat down, the silence in the courtroom was absolute. The ruling came 3 weeks later. Jim's petition was denied. He would receive a modest settlement, but nowhere near what he had demanded. Evelyn called me with the news. "He's dropped the appeal," she said, a smile in her voice. "It's over." For a long moment, I said nothing. The quiet on the other end of the line was filled with something that wasn't triumph, but release. "Thank you," I said finally, "for helping me end it." When I hung up, I realized my hands were steady, my breathing calm. The battle that had once consumed every thought had ended, and I was still standing. That night, I lit a candle and sat by the window, watching the flame dance in the dim light. The air felt different, lighter somehow. Not because I had won, but because I had stopped needing to. Jim hadn't just lost in court. He had lost his power over me. Days passed quietly after that. The calls stopped. The letters stopped. Carol kept her head down at work. For the first time in years, I could focus on my own life without glancing over my shoulder. Yet even in peace, I found myself reflecting. There had been a time when I would have done anything to save my marriage, to hold on to the life I thought I was supposed to have. But in losing it, I'd gained something far more valuable: clarity. Strength isn't forged in victory. It's born in survival. And I had survived everything they'd thrown at me. At work, people began to notice the change. My confidence had a new edge, quiet but unmistakable. When I spoke, people listened. When I walked into a room, they made space. Even Carol seemed to sense the shift. She tried once, tentatively, to re-establish the old dynamic, a soft compliment, a nervous smile. But I met it with nothing but calm indifference. We were no longer adversaries. She simply didn't matter anymore. One afternoon, my assistant stopped by with a hesitant expression. "Margaret, there's a man downstairs asking for you," she said. "Says his name is Jim." I sighed, though not in anger, just weariness. "Tell him I'm unavailable." She hesitated. "He looked lost." "I know," I said softly. "He's been lost for a long time." I never saw him again after that. Weeks passed, and the tension that had gripped my chest for so long began to ease. My days were full again, not of noise or drama, but of quiet purpose. I worked, I cooked, I walked through the park in the evenings. I started painting again, something I hadn't done since my 20s. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night, expecting the familiar wave of sorrow or anger to return, but it never did. The silence felt like peace now, not punishment. It took me years to realize that you don't win every battle by fighting. Some victories come when you finally stop letting the war define you. One evening, I found myself standing at the window once more, watching the city lights shimmer against the dark sky. My reflection stared back at me, older, wiser, but finally free. Jim had taken so much from me, but in the end, he had given me something, too. He had forced me to rebuild. He had forced me to remember who I was before I became someone's wife, someone's caretaker, someone else's shadow. And as I turned away from the window, I felt a quiet certainty settle in my chest. The battle was over, but I wasn't done yet. The next chapter of my life was waiting, and this time I was writing it on my own terms. The months after the court ruling passed like the gentle turning of seasons. There was no explosion of change, no dramatic transformation, just a steady quiet that began to fill the spaces where chaos had lived. For the first time in years, I woke without dread. The mornings were lighter, the air softer. I'd rise early, make coffee, and sit by the window as sunlight crept across the floorboards, warming the silence that had once felt unbearable. Now it felt like peace. Jim's absence no longer haunted me. It existed only as a faint echo. His name, once a wound, became a footnote, a lesson written in invisible ink. At work, life settled into a calm rhythm. Carol, subdued and strangely cautious, kept her distance. I no longer watched her or wondered what games she was playing. Her power had always been borrowed, dependent on my silence and Jim's weakness. Now both were gone, and I had no desire for revenge, only release. I began to focus on myself again. It started with small things: a long walk in the park after work, a new book on my nightstand, a quiet dinner alone that didn't feel lonely. I signed up for an art class, something I'd always wanted to do, but never found the time or courage for. The first time I dipped my brush into paint, I felt something inside me loosen, as though the color itself was pulling me back to life. Each stroke was a declaration: I'm still here. Week by week, my world expanded. I reconnected with old friends, people I had slowly drifted away from during the years of marriage and obligation. When I met them for coffee, they looked at me with quiet surprise. "You look different," one said. "I feel different," I replied, and it was true. I had stopped measuring my worth through the reflection of others. The woman who had once bent herself into shapes that fit someone else's comfort was gone. In her place stood someone simpler but stronger, like steel that had been through fire and come out shining. One afternoon, as I was leaving the office, my lawyer, Evelyn, called. "Margaret," she said, her voice warm. "I thought you'd want to know. Jim finally signed the final documents. It's officially closed. No appeals, no disputes. You're free." Free. The word lingered in my mind long after the call ended. I stood there in the lobby, sunlight filtering through the glass doors, and realized I had been waiting to feel that for years. Freedom wasn't loud or triumphant. It was quiet. It was the kind of peace that comes when you stop carrying a story that no longer belongs to you. That night, I went home and opened the drawer where I'd kept Jim's letter, the one that had shattered everything. For months, I couldn't bear to touch it. Now I unfolded it with steady hands. The ink had faded slightly, the creases soft from time. I read the words again, but they no longer held power. They were just lines of text from a man who didn't know how to stay. I tore the letter in half, then into quarters, then into smaller and smaller pieces until they fluttered like pale confetti into the trash bin. And just like that, the weight was gone. The following weeks bloomed with quiet joy. I took day trips to nearby towns, explored bookstores and art galleries, filled my home with music again. I even laughed, really laughed, at something simple and silly one evening while cooking dinner. The sound startled me. It had been so long since laughter felt natural. I wasn't the same woman who had once waited by the door for a husband to come home. I wasn't the woman who tried to make herself smaller so others could feel whole. I had learned that solitude isn't emptiness. It's space, the kind that allows you to breathe, to grow, to remember who you are when no one is watching. One evening, my friend Sarah invited me out for dinner. We sat on the terrace of a small restaurant, warm light spilling from the windows, the sound of laughter drifting from nearby tables. After a while, she leaned in and asked, "Have you thought about dating again?" I smiled faintly. "I've thought about it," I said. "But for the first time, I'm not in a hurry." She nodded knowingly. "You don't need anyone to complete you, do you?" "No," I said softly. "I think I'm finally complete on my own." That night, when I returned home, I stood by the window and looked out at the city. The lights below shimmered like constellations scattered across the earth. Somewhere out there, life was happening, messy, unpredictable, beautiful. For years, I had been waiting for life to happen to me. Now, I realized it was waiting for me. The next morning, I walked into the office to find a small white envelope on my desk. It wasn't from Jim or Carol, just a handwritten note from one of my younger colleagues. "Thank you for standing up for yourself. You've shown me what strength really looks like." I smiled, feeling an unexpected warmth rise in my chest. Maybe the fight hadn't just been for me. Maybe it had been for every woman who'd ever been made to believe that silence was grace and endurance was love. The world outside my window was still imperfect. People would still betray, still hurt, still disappoint. But I had changed the only thing that ever truly mattered, myself. That weekend, I drove out to the coast alone. The sky was a clean blue, the kind that feels endless. I kicked off my shoes and walked barefoot along the shoreline. The waves curled around my ankles, cold and real, and the wind tangled my hair. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the ocean fill me. For the first time in years, there was no anger, no ache, no fear of what might come next. There was only the rhythm of my heartbeat, steady and sure. I was free. I had survived betrayal, humiliation, and loss. I had walked through the fire and come out not untouched, but alive. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the sea caught its light, turning the water into molten gold. I thought of the woman I used to be, the one who cried over a letter on a rainy Tuesday, and smiled. She had been broken, but she had rebuilt herself. And the woman standing here now, strong, steady, unafraid, owed her everything. I turned from the water, the wind at my back, the future wide open before me, for the first time in a long time. I wasn't running from the past. I was walking toward everything still waiting for me. Let us know in the comment, where are you watching from? Please subscribe to the channel, Her Side of the Story. Thanks for watching until here.